We'll be there.
All right.
Thank you very much.
Great. Okay, everybody hear me all right? Good. Feels like we had better luck with the AV this morning than the keynote, which is always a challenge. I blame Sanyal. That's what happens with closed source hardware, right? You can't go in and fix it. It's not the organizer's fault. It's just what happens. So I'm going to go ahead and get started. There is way more to talk about in this context than I could possibly do in 50 minutes. So I'm going to be very high level. I will be around the rest of the day and would love to continue the conversation. I'll have my Twitter handle is in the upper right-hand corner. I will post the slides. In fact, they're already posted. If you go to slideshare.net/Jackman or speakerdeck/Jackman, you'll find them there. But so we're going to talk today about the drop in the word, structured content in Drupal and WordPress. And so I'll talk a little bit about what I mean by structured content, and then I'm going to go into both of the platforms. This is not a one platform wins kind of presentation. I'm not a one platform wins kind of person. So this isn't about what WordPress is doing right and Drupal is doing wrong, or vice versa. Obviously, we all have our inherent biases based on our experiences, and I will certainly have mine and share them as we go. But I'll open up for some discussion toward the end as well. So, very briefly, my name is John Ekman. I'm the CEO at 10up. 10up is a globally distributed agency that designs and builds content publishing experiences on the WordPress platform. So we're about 85 people, 3.5 years old. Our staff are all over the world. The idea being we think we can hire the best staff wherever they live, rather than only being able to hire talent that works near us. We do, as I said, work primarily on the WordPress platform, which is interesting and relevant to the talk, and I'll mention that again later. Strategy, design, and engineering for large-scale publishing, clients like TechCrunch, Main Today Media, 538 and Grantland at ESPN, so sort of large-scale commercial publishing for the most part, as well as higher ed and nonprofits and some others. Recently launched a product called Push-Up Notifications, which allows you to send Mac OS X desktop push notifications from your WordPress or Drupal site. If you go to pushupnotifications.com, it talks about as easy as WordPress, and it talks about your WordPress site. But there is actually also a Drupal module, which I published, which lives at drupal.org/project/pushup, which speaks to the same API and works the same way and can be done on your Drupal site. So we're going to talk a little bit about you and me. So here's Matt and Dries on stage together at SkippleCon back in, I think, 2009. And how many folks in the room would identify themselves as primarily Drupal developers, designers, users? Okay, and how many would identify as primarily WordPress? Okay, so we're about 50-50. How many would say they feel comfortable, conversant in both platforms? Great, good to hear it. So I was a little concerned after I suggested this topic that I would come off as the WordPress guy at a Drupal conference. It's kind of funny, I've been the WordPress guy at a Drupal conference for many, many years. I kind of am known in Boston for wearing my WordPress shirts to DrupalCon and my Drupal shirts to WordPress conferences. So I've played on both sides of this diagram for many years, spoken and worked and actually contributed code that the God's willing will make its way into Drupal 8. Been a part of the community in Boston. I've also spent a lot of time in the WordPress community, was the founding organizer of WordCamp in Boston, and have spoken at many WordCamps, have keynoted WordCamps, have keynoted Drupal camps regionally. Stepping back from just the drop and the word, I've been working on content management systems for the last 15 years professionally, and longer than that. I think I built my first site in 1994, taught myself Perl and CGI bin because that's what you did then to put sites up on the web. So all of this is just by way of saying two things. One is that I'm old, and the other is that I have worked with lots of these platforms a lot. So what do we mean by structured content or custom content? So we know what we mean by Drupal and WordPress. Two key books for me in the last couple of years, way more key books for me than that, but two that are relevant to this conversation. One is Karen McGrain's Content Strategy for Mobile. The other is Sarah WB's Content Everywhere, both of which are talking about a sort of signal change that has happened in recent years that often gets talked about as responsive web design, but they're coming at it from a more content strategy point of view. They're coming at it from the point of view of the challenge isn't how do we take our web design approach, which is what Ethan is really focused on in responsive web design, and take that into a multi-device world or a post-device world or whatever you want to call it. But how do we think about the content that we're trying to get across, and how do we get that to happen in this multi-device world, right? So both of them are talking about the need to have much more structured content and adaptive content, and what that means is having a system which is more aware of the components that make up a content piece, and getting out of what Karen calls the blobs, right? And Karen's fantastic and smart and wonderful, but I think in content strategy for mobile, the one thing she gets wrong is that she gets WordPress wrong, because she uses it as her primary example of a system that can only do blobs, in which every post has a title and an author, and then one big giant well of HTML cruft into which I put everything that's relevant to that post, which is part of what got me talking about structured content in WordPress, which is part of what led to this talk, so it's all relevant. Sarah, whose last name I'm too smart to try to pronounce, Sarah WB on Twitter, in her book talks about we don't need more content, we need content that does more. So the answer isn't let's make more content for mobile, let's make content for desktop, and let's somehow have them be different. The answer is let's make our content smarter, let's make it structured, let's make the systems that carry and own and present that content smarter about the internals of the content, and that will enable us to live in this multi-device world in a more productive way. We shouldn't be thinking about, targeting specific individual breakpoints named by devices and thinking about the things we know. We should be thinking more from the content out. What's the structure of the content? What's important about it? And then sort of building the experience out from there. One of the major examples that people use in the structured world is NPR. This is an example that is aging a little bit, but NPR was the first sort of large-scale media organization to really move in this direction of the strategy they called COPE, which is create once, publish everywhere, which is to say, instead of having different content management systems for different platforms or different ways of thinking about content for different systems, let's think about the structure of the content itself, store it in a very structured fashion, and then we'll be able to reuse it in all these other channels, right? One of, I think, the improvements on COPE is instead of create once, publish everywhere, it's create once, publish appropriately, or COPA, which I think Margot Bloomstein may have been the one who coined that term, because we shouldn't just think about pushing our content everywhere, we should think about where it's appropriate. But here's an example of NPR's interface from a talk from SlideShare, and you'll notice that what they're doing to structure content is there's the title, subtitle, teaser, mini teaser, display date, updated date, page type, comments, status, organization, keywords. There's way more below this. There's way more fields under the, if you get out of main fields and into the other choices. And the reason for this, again, to link this back to the multi-device world, why do you need a mini teaser? Why do you need a headline and a short headline? Why do you need different sized featured images or thumbnails to be associated with a post? So that they can be used in different contexts, right? And Sarah in her book goes through some great examples with companies like Netflix and how they're adapting the summary of a movie to be different depending on what device you're looking at it on and what length it is, right? There was a great tweet this summer along the lines of truncation is not a content strategy, which is one of Karen's sayings, where the Department of Education and I think Mississippi had tweeted a headline that Mississippi is going to stop educating, and then there was a rest of the sentence, right? But what got tweeted was going to stop educating. It was like that's what happens when you don't have a short headline. That's what happens when you don't have a teaser that fits in Twitter, right? Or you don't have a concept of something that can be used in different places. So for me, structured content and custom content go hand in hand. You could separate them. You could say custom content types and structured content are different conversations. The structured content conversation is around how many fields are in each content type and how closely detailed or typed they are. The custom content conversation is about how many different types can you have, but I think of them as sort of flip sides of the coin or two parts of the same problem. So let's talk a little bit about how Drupal does it. And the Drupalists in the room will forgive my oversimplifications, just as the WordPress folks in the room will forgive me when I go into WordPress. So Drupal, as we know, this blue reads a little light on the screen, but stores everything as nodes, right? Nodes, nodes, nodes. Everything's a node. Of course, should probably be updating this to say entity and all that, but let's just stick with nodes for a minute. A node is any posting such as page, poll, article, forum, topic, or blog entry. Treating all content as nodes allows the flexibility of creating new types. It also allows you to painlessly apply new features or changes to all content. In many ways, the single thing that people first have to wrap their heads around in Drupal is this notion of the node and what it means, right, and its centrality, although now, as I said, probably entity. So how does one create custom content in Drupal? Well, going back to the early days, you would use the Content Construction Kit, CCK, which now that we're living in a world of Drupal 7 and soon to be Drupal 8, we're thinking about as the Fields API. What Drupal does at its core is expose in the admin interface, in the back end, in the logged-in experience that somebody with the appropriate permissions gets access to, right? You WordPress folks think inside/wp-admin, is expose capability to site builders who can create content types, assign fields to them, and create complex views of those content, of that content, right? Views isn't technically a core module in 7, but again, you'll forgive the oversimplifications. What this also does, so users can do so using the admin interface. They can create content types with a tremendous degree of complexity, right? Very specific field types, very specific relationships between field types, very extensive content publishing. The can you cope example, the NPR API could very easily be replicated using custom content types in Drupal. And it also programmatically enables module developers to create content types, field types, and expose them for use by other modules, right? So there's this kind of embarrassment of richness of field types, widgets for rendering and saving fields, interacting with fields, content types that depend on fields, fields that depend on other fields, module interdependencies. There can be a fair amount of complexity involved in this system, as I think most Drupal folks will recognize. Results in a complex web of configuration. One of the ways the community has found to solve that complex web of configuration is through features. In fact, there's a talk later today on using features in Drupal development, right? This is a way, I would argue, it's an adaptation to sort of how Drupal is architected, that we now have this way of exporting features around as a way of managing that complexity. So just a few examples, and I chose not to tempt the demo gods by trying to live demo, so I have just a few screenshots. This, for those of you who are not Drupal folks, is a Drupal 7 admin. I'm in structure content types, where I can see the two content types that were here already, article and basic page. I can click add a content type, and I get this wonderful content types add screen. Lots of attempts to try to help me as an admin understand what it means to create a new content type. Lots of contextual guidance along the way. The options that are here in this left-hand pane are dependent on what modules you have installed, so other modules can add additional options here. But effectively, I'm giving it a name, a description that'll be shown to people as they add content of this type. And then I have a bunch of options. If I save and add fields, now I'm looking at the content type custom. That's my clever name for a custom content type. And I'm looking at the fields that I got by default, which was to say title and body, much like the WordPress interface that Karen is criticizing in her book. And I've got a list of fields with a machine name, a field type, a widget, and some operations. I can add new fields with field types and widgets. I can add existing fields, which is to say I can reuse fields. What fields are available to me in that field type and what widgets are available to me in that widget type are dependent upon other code that I have installed in my infrastructure, right? So different modules enable different field types, enable different widgets for editing field types. This lets me also manage the display of this custom content type as well as how it interacts with commenting system. I can also drag these things around to change their order and prominence in terms of how they're going to be displayed. I can change the input filter for the various kinds of text that's used, right? I'm given kind of a very complex admin approach to create the complexity that I'm after in my content types. This then is views. As I mentioned, the admin interface not only allows you to create kind of this complexity in terms of your content types, but also then some fairly complex ways of displaying that content on the front end. Again, I'm greatly simplifying Drupal 7 here. I realize that. In addition to views, there's things like panels and Panelizer and Panoply and other ways of pulling together content into the page. But effectively, this views screen is letting me choose for a specific page in this case, but I can add displays for feeds or other pages or other panels. What kinds of things I'm going to display? I can select specific fields. I can transform those fields on display. I can create relationships. I can essentially do SQL queries in place. I can add a header and footer that includes dynamic PHP to go have some logic of its own, or I can, without writing a single line of code, install other kinds of modules that create certain views like isotope views or masonry or very complex infinite scrolling kinds of representations of content, all without ever writing any code myself, which brings me to what I consider to be the challenge of Drupal, right? That challenge is with that great power, you can create a lot of complexity, right? It can feel sometimes like you have gone from Drupal as the Swiss Army knife that can do anything to Drupal as the Swiss Army knife that wants to do everything and weighs 10 pounds and costs thousands of dollars. And it can feel like, and this is actually a real, it's not technically a Swiss Army knife, but it's the 500th anniversary edition or whatever that was issued by this company. It's a real thing you could actually buy. It can be overwhelming, right? I think it's not coincidental that in the Drupal community there is a group of folks who self-identify as site builders who are non-coders but whose knowledge of Drupal is deep and extensive and really are powerful super users who can do amazing things without writing any code, right? Or without writing what we would traditionally consider code. Quick example, this is a client that I worked with actually before joining 10up, but that's in Harvard, is at the Women in Public Policy program at Harvard, this gender action portal. URL is there, you can check it out later on your own. This leverages a custom content type for what they call interventions, which are researched, statistically validated things that can be done to address gender gaps globally. So this is part of the Harvard Kennedy School, part of sort of public policy. And so they're looking at various kinds of research interventions, sorting them by different kinds of taxonomies. And so what's happening here is there are 4 focus areas: economic opportunity, politics, health, and education. And then within those, there are various focus areas or target labels like business case, compensation, competition. So the combination of the two is created in this isotope view. So if I click on health, it's going to show me only the subject areas which have interventions inside health that match these labels. And all of that can be created through the views and content types system. There is an isotope plugin that's used that runs a jQuery library, but a user could construct this literally without writing code, right? Which is a fantastic and amazing thing. It's also hooked into Solar Search, which lets people then filter by all the criteria that are built in for the content types. So what date something was published can be narrowed by date range. What focus area it's in can be narrowed in the sort of faceted search experience. Fantastic complexity of structured content. Right now it's primarily rendered in the web, but that same content is available in a structure that could be rendered in all kinds of different contexts, right, including other applications. So fantastic use of structured content that Drupal enabled. So now let's flip and talk about how the Word does it. So when I talk about chunky WordPress, and there's a talk that I gave at WordCamp Boston called Getting Chunky with WordPress that essentially focuses just on the WordPress side of this equation and how to sort of answer Karen's book and say, actually, you could do structured content in WordPress as well. I'm fundamentally talking about 3 things: custom post types, post meta, and custom taxonomies. And so I'm going to talk first about how that's done in code, and then I'll talk a little bit about how it's done in plugins. How does a WordPress admin do this in WordPress core? They don't, right? So you install WordPress 4 out of the box. You will not see anywhere to create custom content types in your dashboard interface. You will not even know they exist. In fact, I've argued it's been one of the challenges in the WordPress world is although we've had custom content types since 2.9 or 3.0, depending on when you want to count it, which is to say for several years, people still think all you can make in WordPress are posts and pages because those are the two types that are exposed natively, right? In fact, there's a lot more you can do, but so in the WordPress world today, you're either doing this in code or via plugins. Jetpack, which is a plugin produced by Automatic, which is the company behind WordPress.com, has recently introduced an add-on that will start to do content types, and so that suggests that WordPress.com is going to head in the direction of having some sense of content types. I say suggests because I have no inside visibility into Automatic's plans, but that does seem like the direction that they will head. And there has been a lot of discussion within the community about what is the right way to start to expose some of this in the admin interface, but for right now, you don't, right? So it just doesn't exist. So I want to talk, and I took the specific code examples out of this presentation in the interest of time. If you look at SlideShare, at my SlideShare or my speaker deck, both of which are on my site, which you can find from my Twitter handle, there are lots of places where there's good content on how to create custom post types and taxonomies in WordPress. I don't need to replicate that for you all here today, but I want to show kind of a little bit of what this looks like. So this is an example. Food Empowerment Project is a nonprofit that I'm on the board of and do technology for. This is a very simple example that just shows what happens when you have alerts or when you have custom post types. So down the left-hand side where I would normally just have posts and pages and comments, I actually have slides and alerts. Those are custom content types, or what the WordPress community calls custom post types. CPTs, which is one of the worst names. We thought CCK was bad. Custom post types is a horrible name for these things because they're not, makes it sound like they're types of posts, which I guess technically they are, but it's not how you should think about them. But so custom content types for alerts. So programmatically in either a plugin or a theme, I can register post types, and once I have registered them, they become available in the navigation as something I can add. They become available in the add new, and then I have a template on the front end that knows how to render them. So those custom post types have a tremendous number of capabilities in the register function. You decide what capabilities they support, whether they support comments, whether they support archives, whether they're displayed to the public, whether they display in the admin UI or not, because you might often one creates hidden post types that sort of happen in the background and the admin shouldn't know about. But so you can register these custom post types with a lot of complexity, and that is the sort of core of how WordPress starts to handle custom content types. In addition to custom content types, you have custom taxonomies. So those of you in the Drupal world talk about and think about taxonomy a lot. In the WordPress world, traditionally taxonomy was used for categories and tags. But custom taxonomies can be added. Custom taxonomies can be added to existing post types or to new custom post types. And there are ways of grouping and separating and sorting. So here's an example from Generation Citizen, which is another nonprofit I worked on as part of GiveCamp New England 2 years ago. They send college students into underrepresented populations from a political participation point of view to teach them about civics. They come up with a project that they're going to do as a team where they're going to try to influence policy in their town or neighborhood. They actually try to identify influencers and go after them and make change happen. The idea being that if, as a youth, you see the impact of civic involvement, you're much more likely to remain involved later into life. So this is a part of their site where they store stories, which came from that experience. Each of these stories has both a location and a topic. Those locations are here when I'm, here is the screen where I'm editing locations. So these are places where those interventions have happened. And then here's an actual story being edited, and you can see that in addition to the sort of standard metadata that you would get, there are locations and topics. In the case of WordPress, just like in Drupal, it's code that determines how these things are edited. So there's code to register these meta boxes and decide what kind of presentation they get. It is, to be fair, considerably less closer to the metal in the WordPress world. I was going to say less sophisticated, but that's not probably the right way to say it. In the sense that you are doing more of the code writing to determine the widget that's going to be used to determine how this thing is edited than I think is happening in the Drupal side. And then in addition to these custom taxonomies, you've also got what is called custom meta or post-meta. Again, I'm not terribly happy with the term post-meta. The reason it's called post-meta is because originally this was for meta information about posts. I would argue that as we're getting into custom content types, that post-meta is actually part of the content rather than purely meta information, but nonetheless, post-meta is the name of the table it lives in, and that's what everybody calls it. And those things that you're editing on the right are called meta boxes, so that's the terminology we're stuck with. In this case, for the stories content type, I have added the school in which the story occurred, the teacher, the democracy coaches that were involved, and a pull quote. The reason that that pull quote is important is that it's stored as structured content in the system. So again, going back to the sort of notion of structured content, you could do a pull quote just in line in a regular blog post, right? You can do pull quotes anywhere you want. You can style things. You could put HTML directly into the blog post. Having it as a separate field, though, lets us then, on render time, decide what's the appropriate way to handle this for the device that we're on, right? So maybe that pull quote goes off in a sidebar on a sort of desktop display. Maybe in the mobile display it's actually put to the top. Maybe in the internet fridge version of stories it's the only thing that you see until you click in deeper. The point is we stop thinking about what device it's on and start thinking about what's native to the structure of the content itself is the notion that this pull quote is important, right? A couple of examples from the WordPress world. Here's a quick video showing. Good, I wasn't sure the video would work on a live Google Hangout. This is something we built for Juicy Couture that lets them pick a layout from the top for the left side of the page and the right side of the page, and then they're selecting stories to go into that layout. And each of these stories has post thumbnails or featured images in the various shapes and sizes to fit into each of those places in the layout. So we've essentially created a kind of puzzle piece layout that says you want your homepage to be dynamic, you want it to be constantly changing, you want it to look different all the time. If each of these bits has the right kind of feature image for this format and for that format and for the tall, skinny format, and they're not just automated system crops, there's an automated system to replace the crops if they're not, but they can be overridden by an editor who can say, no, actually in the tall orientation, right, this image has to be used. It's a much more curated kind of experience. But so long as each of those posts has all of those sizes of images, then putting them together becomes an editorial curation experience rather than a sort of system-driven, just throw it all together experience. And custom post types and post meta are a key part of that. More complex example, which launched recently, this is for the Press Herald in New Hampshire, the Portland Press Herald, or Maine Today Media. Again, there's a longer case study of this in a talk that I gave at WordCamp Maine, which will be video of which will be available shortly. But in their case, you'll notice there's lots of custom content types going on down the left-hand side here, home pages and section fronts. We use custom post types in combination to allow them to curate various home pages and section fronts. So you can think of this as kind of like panels or Panoply in the Drupal context in which we're bringing together a bunch of different content into specific layouts and then presenting them to the user. So all of these things, all of these individual widgets that are being assembled together here rely on custom post types under the hood to be able to sort of pull together different content types into a new display. I'll click on through. So that's done in code. So done in code, the developer has a chance to determine and influence and control to a very specific degree what the admin experience is like. Right? There's a lot of sort of craft that goes into deciding what should the flow be like of creating this experience. Helen Ho-Sandi, who works for us at 10up and was the release lead on WordPress 4, works a lot with our team to make sure that the experiences we're creating for editors are very consistent with the rest of the WordPress experience, so they don't kind of stand out and you don't feel like you've left native WordPress behind and gone into custom code land, but you feel like you're still working with the WordPress experience even though there's new capabilities. In plugins, there are a lot of plugins that have arisen to try to solve this need. This one is from a plugin called Pods. Pods, created by Scott Kingsley Clark, who also now works for us at 10up, though we didn't at the time, was essentially the CCK of the WordPress world. So it was around earlier than custom post types made their way into WordPress. It was a first attempt at letting you create custom post types. It did some interesting things with creating its own tables that were very not the core WordPress way, but were more experimental and innovative. It's in the process now in 3.0, which is being developed now, or in some of the later versions of 2, which are available. You can choose whether to use WordPress's more native post and post meta storage, or to use separate tables. So they're kind of evolving in the direction of more native. But you can see that it offers some of the kinds of things that you would expect if you were used to building custom content types in Drupal. It starts to enable different field types with their own kind of sets of validation and ways of being rendered and edited, right? So much the same way that, say, like a date module in Drupal would expose a date picker, and you don't have to go through and code all of that yourself as part of building a custom module. Pods can start to expose a lot of that as well. Another one that's very popular is Advanced Custom Fields. Advanced Custom Fields has a lot of various kinds of add-ins. In the Advanced Custom Fields world, many of those add-ins are commercial, as in paid for. Typically still distributed under GPL, but paid for, which is to the Drupal world kind of an interesting concept, but to the WordPress world actually fairly common. This is one of the places where the two communities differ a bit. So that's kind of how the two platforms operate. Now I'm going to give you my hypotheses about what WordPress can learn from Drupal and vice versa. And then I'm going to open up to sort of questions from you all, or comments. So when I think about, and as I said, I've spent a lot of time in the last 5 years in particular in both communities. And I think both are fantastic platforms. I would be very happy to see both WordPress and Drupal continue to take over market share in the world of content management. I'm giving a talk actually at WordCamp San Francisco called Learning from the Other 80%, which is about what is the rest of the world doing that isn't using WordPress. And part of that argument is it would be bad for all of us, for any single platform, to have 80% of the web's sites running on it, right? The recent Heartbleed vulnerability that affected a lot of platforms should be a sign to us that monocultures are bad. We don't want everybody in the world using the same CMS platform. We want all CMS platforms to get better and smarter, and I want the communities to learn from each other. So this is not, again, an attempt to say one of these is right. There's a approach to thinking about CMS that I have always used, which is there are a number of ways that you can succeed. There are probably a handful of platforms that would work for any given use case, maybe a half dozen. There are limitless ways that you will fail, right? So stop spending your time trying to pick the right horse and focus more on the race as a whole, and you'll be better off, right? So what can WordPress learn from Drupal? I think there are a couple of things. First, bringing together content types, plugins, and other configuration into shareable features. So in the WordPress community, and this is in part a heritage of how custom post types and themes evolved over time, the interaction between them is not always clear. So you're creating a new custom content type. Does that belong in a theme or a plugin? The answer is yes, right? So you can put that as part of your theme, and you can add that code into the functions.php in your theme. And what that means is the site is now essentially locked to that theme at some level. Locked is probably too strong a word, but if they were to switch to another theme, that other theme won't know about those custom content types and therefore won't be able to display them, and that's problematic. On the other hand, you can put it in your plugin, but then there's still a problem when user switches themes because the plugin doesn't actually determine the output, right? So you can declare what's called a single page template inside the plugin that can be overridden by the theme, but that interaction is very kludgy compared to the sort of interaction that has existed in the Drupal community for a long time between fields defined in code and how they're rendered in a theme through theming functions at a much more granular level, right? It's harder to achieve that same kind of interaction in the WordPress world. There are some good solutions using theme supports, which can be extended. So there's a filter that says this theme supports a certain content type that you can enable other themes to support, but it's very custom. It depends kind of situation anytime you're looking at this interaction. Better integration of custom content types with display logic and theming without shortcodes. So even many of those plugins that I showed, things like Advanced Custom Fields or Pods, you created all this great structured content. Now you actually want to render it on the front end. you're writing PHP code in a template file, right, to display it. Whether you're putting that in your plugin or your theme, there's still some custom effort to be done. Those plugins try to make that simpler by supporting shortcodes, so you can, in writing your post, say, oh, I know I have a bit of metadata to drop in here. I can square brackets it in a shortcode, and it'll get replaced by the system on display. But that's still, from my perspective, kind of janky. It's using shortcodes in a way that doesn't really represent the relationship that you'd like to have. Better integration of what is now stored as post meta with primary body, content, and title for search and display. WordPress, by default, if you're using built-in WordPress search, which you probably shouldn't be, only searches the body and title. It doesn't search post-meta, so these extra metadata that you've attached just won't be found. There are lots of solutions to that problem, both in plugin space and in code, but it's just an example of, again, this stuff is called post-meta, but it's not necessarily really meta. It's actually part of the content in some cases, and there isn't really a good way to differentiate between the two. So the display, by default, won't necessarily know how to display all of the post-meta you've created. In fact, it won't unless you do something about it. And then defining in core a true field API to create consistency. So the way in which lots of different WordPress developers and development shops have been experimenting with custom fields and field types feels a lot like Drupal in the 4.7 era, right? As sort of a lot of different things were sort of evolving and emerging. And I'd love to see a bit more clear field definition so we could get to the point where there was a date field, where there was a specific kind of field that was used. Not necessarily in core itself, because of the WordPress philosophy, which I'll talk about later, but at least sort of well-defined and understood so that there was a sort of cleaner and more consistent way of making that representation. And then lastly, let's stop calling them custom post types and start calling it structured content or custom content or whatever. So flip side of that, what do I think Drupal could learn from WordPress? So at its core, for me, the difference between the two platforms is in many ways evidenced by the WordPress core philosophy, right, which is found at that URL on the right. Simplicity is a virtue in the admin experience. I think it's not that the Drupal community hasn't paid attention to usability increasingly since probably 5, because I think 6 made great leaps forward, and 7 is even better, and 8, from what I have seen and experimented with, continues down that path. But it is still very complex for admins. That learning curve for somebody who is in their first 6 months of learning how to use Drupal as an administrator is way higher. The difficulty in sort of learning and understanding how all of those attributes can be used together is much higher. The complexity of even the seasoned Drupal veteran who runs into a conflict in versions between ctools and date module and views and this specific views picker and this JavaScript and this jQuery module, and how all of that comes together can make your brain hurt, right? And that's an experience I think all of us have had, right? I don't say that to be critical. WordPress has this notion that smart decisions are better than options. Drupal seems to have the notion of make everything an option and expose it in the admin panel. One of the things I'd love to see Drupal do more often that WordPress often does is exposing options that are only exposed to people who write code through filters, right? So capital P, dang it, which was mentioned in the opening phrase, right in the opening. There's a filter you can set to disable that. It's not presented as a checkbox anywhere in the admin because that's just another distraction to somebody who is learning to use the system to have a checkbox somewhere that says, don't correct my lowercase p's to capital P's when I write the word WordPress. But people wanted it as an option, so it's exposed as a filter, right? So there are lots of ways to handle that. In a similar way, the decision not to expose custom content types in the WordPress dashboard as a UI, I think was absolutely the right decision for the WordPress community, for where our users are, for where we are in that curve. That will change when we feel like we have the right way as a community to expose those options in the UI in a way that doesn't create user confusion, right? And so kind of keeping that value. The value in backward compatibility, so the notion that I don't need to do a fundamental rewrite every couple of years of my site is one that I would love to see the Drupal community think more about. Not suggesting heresy here, but And then lastly, that user's experience is as important as technical architecture. I had a slide in a presentation I've given before that puts Matt and Dries up and talks about their backgrounds and says, you know, do these projects bear the imprint of their founders? I'm actually taking it out because I think it gives a little bit too much importance to the founders themselves. But there's definitely a sense of Dries as a PhD in high-performance computing in Java, who's focused on enterprise architecture, and Acquia as a company founded on bringing Drupal to the enterprise IT world. And Matt as somebody who left college as a saxophone major to go work at CNET, and WordPress and Automatic as a company whose mission is to democratize publishing. Right? The feature Matt is most excited about in WordPress is distraction-free writing mode, because it's all about the content and getting the content in front. Whereas Dries is excited about, you know, semantic RDF in core, right? They're just fundamentally different ways of thinking about what a project does. So that I'll open for Q&A and thoughts from the audience. Yeah, on the back first. Yeah, you in the short. Sorry.
So I think with development, is there a thought in the WordPress world, like we want to make sure we don't want to, like I guess on a lot of Drupal projects, some people have this idea, like, I never want to write custom code. There should be a module for everything. So the idea of, like, I don't have to write custom code. But it obviously adds tons of complexity.
Right.
So do you think WordPress is still trying to veer, okay, people are just going to have to write code for some things, and that's going to eliminate a lot of complexity?
Yeah, I think they think about it from, they place different values on different parts of that question, right? So it isn't that the WordPress community loves to write custom code, because there's very much that sense of every line of code you write is an obligation to the future, because it means somebody has to maintain it and manage it and all that. But in cases where leverage of a well-defined API with a relatively small amount of code creates a tailored experience for the user who's actually having to maintain and admin the site, that's favored over something that might be more technically elegant or might have more reuse on the technical side, because of the impact that it has on the user experience, right? At the same time, I think, you know, a way to say it that would be, sounds more critical of the Drupal community than I intended to, but I'll just say it and then we can discuss it, is it sometimes feels like the Drupal community prioritizes developer experience over user experience and focuses on what's going to make this code better in the long run to develop and maintain than what's going to make this experience better for the user. And I think WordPress has a tendency to fall on the other side, which is to say what's going to create the better experience, even if under the hood it means the API is disorganized and confusing. And you know, somebody like Andrew Nason, who's one of the lead developers of WordPress, will talk about, we can fix that over time in the background without the end user having to know, right? And so it takes a much more gradual, we'll clean up the back end as we go, rather than let's throw it all away and start over again as we move from one version to another because we think this will be a better architecture on the back end. That's, again, very, very broad strokes, but you know, I think custom content isn't a terrible thing when the alternative is an experience that's going to get confusing. And there's debate within the community even about, so I showed pods, for example, as Scott Kingsley-Clark wrote. There's debate even within 10up about, is that the right approach? Because pods can head in that same direction where it can expose a lot of admin that can let you create things that then are difficult to maintain, not because they're code, but because they're complex configuration that now is in some ways non-standard or not a part of core. And so even within our own firm, sometimes there's disagreement about, wouldn't it be better to just custom code those content types, because then at least we're following the API and we know exactly what needs to change and there isn't any confusion about what's stored where or anything like that because it's following a very well-established pattern. So, you know, I think there's multiple ways to see that. But you had a question at a time?
Well, I'm a total neophyte here. Mm-hmm. But it sounds like both systems are trying to reinvent HTML.
So, yeah, so structured content, in many ways, I mean, the great joke is, you know, I have a web page that I found in the Wayback Machine that I created in 1996, and it's perfectly responsive, right? Because it's HTML1, and it just responds because there's nothing fixed about it, right? There's no tables that don't. So yes, in lots of ways, there is this battle between design control for the web and standard generalized markup, which is presentation independent and works everywhere. I think that's sort of I gave a talk at WordCamp New York called Postmodernism and Modernism in the Fight for the Web. And it's about exactly that tension. On the one hand, we want this stuff to be content that renders independently and works everywhere, and HTML is fantastic for that. And then we keep trying to muck it up by focusing on pixel-perfect page design and making it look the same on all devices and making it, designed with a certain eye toward presentation that mixes them together. Structured content, as Sarah, WB, and Karen talk about it, is a way of not saying let's go all the way back to SGML, but let's go back to HTML, which was, after all, itself a descendant of SGML, and try to honor kind of the spirit of HTML5, which says you have this structured layer, and then you have CSS on top of it and JavaScript for interactions. And if we keep those layers more separate at the core of the CMS, we shouldn't be putting style into our WYSIWYG fields. We should be putting structure there, and then we should be styling in the CSS things, right? So in some ways, you're right. It does feel a bit like HTML. Yeah.
Just because so I'm a Drupal developer, and from that background, and just the point about having exportability of types, features, for say, I think the biggest that's the reason that's most powerful for us is the ability to put that in source code control and use that for deployment. So I guess I'm just wondering if that's something that's lacking.
Yeah, no, that's an excellent point for people who couldn't hear or didn't follow. So in the Drupal world, I mentioned features as an export. In Drupal 8, there's a whole CMI initiative to sort of manage configuration in YAML files and essentially create ways to take all this configuration that happens and make it easy to move from one server to another. So the move from development to testing to staging to production, the move from my single production server to my cloud of 50 production servers that all have to have the same configuration. And also get that configuration into source code control management so that it's not sitting in a database field somewhere serialized, but actually available. That is, I think, I guess I'll call it a weakness in the WordPress community, which is to say the focus on integration of multiple development teams and multiple servers is not in the WordPress community where it is in the Drupal community. So things like UUIDs and all the work that has been done in Drupal to help deal with content publishing across multiple platforms, across multiple servers. There are approaches to doing that. Pantheon, for example, who's one of the sponsoring organizations here and is a partner of ours, has a wonderful Git-based workflow that helps you manage deployments across multiple servers, including content migration and configuration migration, and so they're pulling database stuff and doing magic behind the scenes to make it work. I think the reality is, again, sort of based on the audiences that each of the products have been serving, Drupal was faster to recognize this kind of multi-server environment and focus on making the developer experience in that better. WordPress has lagged in part because the end user and the business owner and the content editor sort of don't care about any of that stuff, right? At some level. Now, whether they should or not is a different question. But again, I think it's a reflection of focus more than capability. But it is something that larger scale WordPress shops are finding their own solutions to, like many Drupal shops did before sort of Core figured out lots of better ways to do it. I'm going to go in the back first, and then I'll come back to you.
I was thinking on this line of speaking, is this a problem when you have to create custom content types? So a new program would come in and you have to research what the last one did for these custom content types in WordPress. Whereas in Drupal, it's content types and it's pretty normal from someone else's configuration to see what they did in the content types very easily. Would it be easy to see that in WordPress?
See, I mean, I almost feel like the answer would be just the opposite, which is to say, because in WordPress it's all in code and you could see the source code history and you can see exactly what's happened. My experience, at least as a Drupal 7 administrator and developer, was that it was sometimes way more complicated to try to figure out in configuration is what I'm seeing on the page coming from some logic in this view, or is it coming from some PHP code in a template, or is it coming from some JavaScript, or it was actually much more complicated to pick up somebody else's work and figure out what was happening. You could argue it was more complicated because it was more powerful, right? I mean, those two do have a tendency to run together. What we're trying to get to is more power without more complexity, which is a hard thing to do naturally, but I feel like the cases where I have had to take over other people's work, which I have done on both platforms, it has always been easier on a WordPress side to remediate and figure out what was happening and fix it than it has been on the Drupal side. I don't know if that's a comment on the Drupal developers I've taken over from and the WordPress developers I've taken over from or what, but that has certainly been my experience, that it's always been easier to figure out what's happened on that side. So as I said, we all have our experiences are all different, right? All right, I think that's time, but I'll be around and available. Thank you.